Sheenam, before you start, let me announce the rules, which is that we have speakers from all over the world. So many of whom they don't have, English is not their first language. So if we could like all adopt like an appropriate pace of speaking so that it can be understood by everyone and it is accessible to others as well. Live caption is going to be enabled. So if anyone wishes to disable it or enable it, you can do it personally through your own, but from our end, it is going to be enabled. At the 9th minute, I'm going to give like a soft reminder to the panelists. It will be through a reaction or through a direct chat. So which will like kind of indicate that you have like a couple of minutes more to wrap up. Everyone is requested to be respectful and polite. Hate speech of no kind would be, of any kind would be accepted, and it can result in immediate removal. If you're not the speakers, we request you to switch off your video and put yourself on mute so that we can like save on the bandwidth. And all the panels are being recorded except the Q&As. And if you wish not to be recorded, please, you can switch off your videos. Right? The chat will be open to for questions throughout, but will be addressed only after all the papers have been presented. So with that, I will start with my introduction. I am Samrat Sharma. I'm pursuing my PhD, well, a dual PhD now in childhood studies and women and gender studies. I'm interested in seeing how trans adults use memory and introspection to talk about pronouns in their childhood, in their autobiographies, right? So with that, I invite Sheenam Batra, who's presenting on disabling play through the monstrous bodies. Over to you, Sheenam.
Hi, I'm Sheenam Batra, and I've taught at several colleges of University of Delhi. I am a PhD research scholar and about to submit my PhD thesis, enrolled in the University of Delhi. So before I begin my paper, I have a request to make. As you can see, I've sprained my elbow. So if you can take the questions, because I'm in a lot of pain right after the paper, that would be grateful. But if not, it's perfectly fine. So I begin my paper, and firstly, I'll begin with, what nudged me to write this paper. And with that, you can, actually get the thought process also that I'm working with. So when I was working on my MPhil dissertation quite a few years back, and that was the concept of adulterated child, adulterated like, adult connotations also being there, like how adults try to manipulate children. I had interacted with children, aged 5 to 10 years old, asking them about their leisure materials, playthings, and toys, which were given to them by the adults, or which were, suggested to them by the adults. And this is one of the conversations that I recollect, that I had with a girl who was, who I found, busy disfiguring and disabling her doll by scarring the doll's face with pencils and pen marks. And when I asked her what she felt about this doll, like why she was doing this, she responded that it did not feel good enough as a doll to play with, as her physiognomy and physiology were not somatically pleasant and suited for, as an ideal doll. She was using all her force to loosen one of the arms of her doll. And this child revealed that disfigurement and disabling was the sole palliative and alternative that she had to request her parents for a new doll as a present. So you see immediately, how disability comes up as a pretext to discard the doll as a plaything, as an incompetent body, as a valid excuse not to play with it. But at the same time, what we also get to see subtly is a child's response to disability and a predilection to play with a certain kind of body. So this is one of the entry points to the paper. The second anecdote that I'm going to share is quite an intimate and lived experience. So quite early in my childhood, I suffered from alopecia, which is, premature falling of hair. And instead, what I had was odd patchy spot of residual hair growth on my scalp. And with such a medical condition, what happened was my childhood acquaintances, they confessed that it gave me an unusual and unpleasant, distasteful look. So they had they said that they had never confronted someone who was physiognomically like that. And in the beginning, some of my schoolmates, they chanted the jingle, which I clearly remember, and I remember the tone also: ganji by ganji, buddhi by buddhi, which is bald is the old woman, bald woman, old woman, old woman. And whenever I approached these kids to play with them, I was completely barred from any sort of interaction, forget about play. So, and as part of my medication, I was given steroids, which had terrible, if side effects on me. I began to have a lot of hair growth and hair on my neck, which again was like, so children began to see me as kind of, with this bearded, like a kind of demon witch that I seemed to them. So eventually parents came up with the request that please don't make our child sit with this kid. And eventually you see the definitions began to be very loose for loosen up. First I was barred from play. I began to be seen as a diseased body. And of course, as a child, since I faced such situations, I was thought, I gradually acquired morose kind of comportment and behavior. So I was also thought to be physically disabled and mentally incompetent. So you see how the slippages came to occur, and that were there. So a few of these childhood acquaintances who later became my friends, they confessed that they were at loss for vocabulary at that particular age in their childhood, and they had relied on immediate resources like their parents or knowledge and culture, to supply them with vocabulary as to comprehend what they were facing. It was not, and I feel it's sheerly it doesn't do justice even to those children, because I won't consider them as sheerly evil or wicked, seeing me like that. So it's incorrect, to see this kind of binary and see them in a categorical way. So with this kind of complexity of how an able-bodied child perceives, one with physiognomy slightly altered or anti-normative physiognomy, where you have the chance of slipping into a disabling body, like linguistically disabling, also the play on the word dis that is there. So what becomes of play? So now I begin with the paper. The title of my paper is Disabling Play Through the Monstrous Bodies. The expressive, creative, and formative aspects of play have been extensively discussed in literature. However, I feel, that scholarly discussions have been quite scanty, and critical writings, have been relatively very scanty to address the mythopoetic, somatic, and aesthetic ideology of able-bodiedness and ableism laced in a play. For instance, if you notice the Gudda Gudiya, who are not simply the repository of cultural, gendered, and familial values, they are equally somatically pleasant, aesthetic, and functionally able-bodied humanoid playthings. Further, the inspiration for play and playthings derived, like if you recollect, at least the Indian games, mythological games that we used to play, and specifically after the Shera and all, with Dhanush of Rama and Gada of Hanuman, Bhima, strength and muscularity, they were all, they have all been the attempts to celebrate and sustain religious values, but they also glorify the ideal of mythopoetic able body, its efficient functionality, finesse, and values, so on and so forth. Tacitly, therefore, play becomes a methodology to sanitize asuras or demons and the mayhem they wreak. But play is also tactful genocidal eviction of somatically and physiognomically disabled bodies. So in my paper, I'm going to study, Arundhati Venkatesh's series fiction, the book Asuras. I wish to dwell on the thornier questions about play, whether play is an activity of prerogative, which is accessible to only able-bodied children, either as a plaything or as a playmate. Towards what kind of body does the able-bodied child evince her or his predilection? Further, what becomes of play itself when a disabled body begins to play? So the protagonist in both the text of this series fiction is Bala, who is a young boy and an avid reader of books and a vivacious recipient of popular forms of art like television cartoons and the mythological folk tales his tata tells him. However, Bala is not quite keen to play with his able-bodied sister Meera. Rather, he considers her playful antics as utterly repulsive. When Meera playfully bites her brother's toe, Bala foul-mouths a litany of derogatory metaphors at her and hastily concludes her to be a baby mimic monster. Further, he is disgusted at Meera's physiognomy, especially her hideous, freshly shaven head. I recollect my own. In another episode, Bala finds Meera nibbling at his books with a few pieces of paper, and I quote, sticking to baby's teeth like fangs. Bala howls in paranoia to save his precious books from his sister, while their Amma takes a look at the scene and gushes happily, complimenting Meera for the able-bodied smartness she has already begun to exhibit. It is significant to note that in his inflamed imagination and volatile outbursts at Meera, Bala's response triggers the debate if he finds Meera's play, and play in general also, offensive and repulsive because he finds her somatically unpleasant, or does Meera's somatically unappealable disability makes her gestures and play distasteful, nudging us to think what becomes of play when bodies with disability begin to play. Thus, within this framework of interpretation, obnoxious meaning is allocated to play and playfulness as a gestural activity which bodies with disability exhibit. However, as readers, we should be hesitant in tarring with this conclusive interpretation of play because the latter severely compromises Bala's identity as a child. Within the former reading, Bala's identity as a child is cancelled out, and his responses to Meera's play are interpreted categorically as the hubris of typically able-bodied man with his sheer disgust for a body with disability and all that it can do. Alternatively, if we read and rethink through Bala's identity as a child, a wholesome and nuanced response emerges where Bala's revulsion at physiognomical, if we read and think through Bala's identity as a child, a wholesome and nuanced response emerges where Bala's revulsion at physiognomy actually through which he senses the world, from where emerges the messy dialectic of realism and the fantasy of awe exaggeration in his urge to articulate what he discerns. And if you look, children basically feel competition, malevolence, and baser feelings, which further, and Bala feels that his parents cater all their affection onto the, baby always. This propels him further to disfigure and disable Meera's physiognomy and demonize her. As has been aforementioned, it is Amma who compliments and validates Meera's play because it fits well within the ableist economy of meaning making and interpretation. So in this context, Bala's distastefulness at her sister's play, tinged with his personal feelings towards her, actually critiques and parodies the able-bodied paradigm of play, which in its emphasis on functionality introduces a modality of somatic and physiognomic expressiveness, which makes a child look all the more monstrous and disabled. So a word of caution is in order. Bala's identity as a child should not be considered as an iconoclastic orientation to critique the able-bodied paradigm of play, nor should it be elementarily used as a palliative to diatribe against the bodies with disability. To read through the orientation of child is to acknowledge the plurality which emerges in a child's perception of the world. This plurality of child's experience is fulfilling and simultaneously communicates the naturally lived experience of child's mode of perception. It explains Bala's sheer pleasure in listening to Tata's tale. The tales told by Tata are mythological rendition of deities' victory over demons. The first tale he tells is of Bhima, the mighty warrior who conquered Bakasura. Though Tata does not offer any physiological description of Bakasura's body, Bala imagines the latter to have a disabled body, which is somatically unpleasant, with eyebrows which look like brooms and mouths like fans. The second tale he tells is of Kabanda, the demon who was cursed to remain with a headless body, with an enormous yellow eye in his chest and his mouth being located in its belly. Tata informs Bala that Kabanda was defeated by the brothers Ram and Lakshman, who were killed in skillful warfare. Tata tales are, his tales are laced with the ideology of, where he glorifies ableism and able-bodied men over bodies with disability. But the compulsorily climactic ending to each of these tales, which consummates in conflict, produces an oblique critique of play through its meta-narrative of coincidence, whereby hostility is the only encounter which can occur when an able-bodied and disabled...
A couple of minutes. I just wanted to stop you for just a couple of minutes, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay. And disabled body, where, hostility is the only encounter which can occur when an able-bodied and a disabled body come in contact with each other. Okay. So Bala's playful laughter and safe contact with these monstrous bodies with disability is as fragile as the fictionalized world of these stories. When he takes a walk to the local market, Bala is revolted at the sight of ghastly heads, that are that stand over the houses, ghastly heads like those of Bakasura, and he feels utterly nauseous and feverish at the sight of such heads. So this entire episode, undercuts the easy humor of laughter that Bala has had in the world of fiction. And Bala's uneasiness, in fact, is more like a response to, the double standards of the society, of the able-bodied society, which on the one hand is obsessed with, these bodies, and on the other hand executes schemes to sanitize their fictional and real world through the eviction of monstrous bodies with disability. So now I'm coming to the conclusion of my play. So what happens is, in both the tales, Bala meets the modified mythological rendition of Tata's tales, Bukasura and Kubandi, from Bakasura to Bukasura and Kaban to Kubandi. Bala procrastinates any contact with either of the two as he relies on the institutional knowledge of the books he has had. When Bukasur mightily asks Bala about his identity, the latter mumbles the title of the books he has read in response to these queries. This temporarily delays in bringing Bala and Bukasura in contact with each other. However, when the latter realizes that Bala is carrying his books with him, he smacked his lips, popped the books in one of his mouths, munched and chewed them with great relish and gobbled them. Similarly is the case, Kubandi also devours his books. So both the episodes of book eating incisively critique the socio-cultural, institutionalized and official modes of disinterested engagement with the bodies with disability. Books act as barriers which prevent any real contact with these bodies. And if they do so, it is with, gravitas. Okay, I realize that I'm running out of time. So what I'll do is, what happens is Bala, therefore frames a scheme, according to what happens in mythology, where he designs the plot, but not to defeat. There's a word that is used is only to overcome these bodies, not to defeat these bodies. And at the end, what happens is that Bala gently pats the belly of Kubandhi when she confesses, that about her problems, scatological problems and scent that comes from her body. And Bala, in his innocence, when they have reached through the paradigm of play, contact of cordiality, what Bala does is he doesn't exploit such information, and he rather confesses, that all the human beings do that. It's not simply. So this is the innocence of the child, that he's oblivious to this kind of information, factual information, and doesn't exploit it within the so-called empirical economy of differentiation and discrimination. Therefore, play emerges as a requirement for a humane, compassionate encounter and a truthful, natural understanding between the able-bodied and persons with disability. I'll just...
Thank you. So since we are shorter time, I'm going to quickly move on to Devalina. So Devalina, if you could start.
I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
So I quickly share my screen because I'll be dealing with Malik Sajjad's graphic novel. So I think it's important for the audience as well to look into this. The title of my paper is Guns, Bullets, and Wood Carvings, deconstructing the images of violence, suffering, and healing in Malik Sajjad's graphic novel. So I'll start with this comparison that Malik Sajjad makes in his debut graphic novel between Hangul, which is also known as the Kashmir stag, and the people he illustrates in his book. Hangul is a subspecies of Central Asian red deer found in the Zabarwan range of the Western Himalayas, led along the valley of Kashmir. Malik Sajjad, in his debut novel, Munu, a boy from Kashmir, portrays the people of Kashmir as Hanguls, famously called the Kashmir stag. These exotic species of elks was once found in abundance, grazing through the mountain ranges. However, deforestation, hunting, and poaching has led to the complete destruction of their natural habitat, making them a critically endangered species. Sajjad literally draws a parallel between the Hanguls and the Kashmiris, with centuries of brutal oppression, violence endured by both. Now, Munnu is a semi-autobiographical novel tracing Sajjad's own formative years in Batamanlu with his family during the Kashmir insurgency. Munnu's story depicts the usual tale of those many children born and brought up amidst war, his innocent perception of the world around him, and his blissful ignorance of the world out of his sight paints an empathetic picture of a reality unknown to people witnessing wars from a distance. The syntax of violence, struggle, and suffering is embedded in the vocabulary of these children, which is seamlessly articulated in the book using the technique of black and white woodblock style sketches, similar to the historic paintings of, as you can see, German expressionist painter Kathe Kollwitz depicting poverty, hunger, and effects of war on the working class people in the 1990s. Likewise, Munnu's gripping imageries and quirky dialogues derives direct influence from Joe Sacco and his groundbreaking works in comic journalism on the history and politics of Israel and Palestine. In the novel, the technique of woodcut painting is symbolized by Munnu's father, Gulea. He's an artisan who carves out illustrations on walnut wood blocks. It is Gulia who teaches his youngest son to draw. Munnu finds it very difficult to draw portraits, landscapes, and imitate his father's illustrations initially. However, he finds it comparatively easy to draw an AK-47. Sajja's graphic novel is also an illustrated comic strip presenting solemn actualities as satires or ironies. In an ironic scene, as you can see at the beginning of the novel, Sajjad shows how children are affected and influenced by war, how they, born with the burden of a devastating time, project their lives in a language infused with a lingo, comprehending guns, bullets, army, martyrs, curfews, terrorists, etc. Munnu's drawing of an AK-47 and the contagious fervor showed by his friends at school around an uncomplicated sketch of the gun they are used to see in roads, also at homes, is unbelievable, yet a reality that cannot be ignored. Now, coming back to another author of a very famous memoir, Basharat Pure, in his Curfewed Night, writes about the schools being used as military camps to counter guerrilla attacks from local mutineers. Though Pure belongs to the wealthy middle class who can choose between schools for their children's education, Munnu's family, on the contrary, possesses no such privilege. He has to study in government provision schools, which are regularly closed and lifted to unrelated places across the city due to the many battles fought between the Indian Army and the resistance groups. Once, Munnu's school is shifted to a broken house in Balgadin, which was previously inhabited by the Kashmiri Pandits. One of the abandoned houses, draped in wood, smashed in war, is converted into a school which bans the language of the land, which is Kashmiri. Large pamphlets, discouraging the use of Kashmiri and encouraging an English medium education, are hung over the family pictures and Hindu relics covering the colossal walls of the house. After a couple of curfews, the school infrastructure is again shifted. This time, the classrooms are situated on the first floor of a wheat shop. Sajjad draws a shuddering comic strip that shows laborers carrying their sacks of wheat, walking along the students, carrying their bags on their back, both entering a wrecked building in a unified line. Now coming back to history, the history of Kashmir. For the Kashmiris, after the winter of 1990, militants became synonymous to martyrs. Every household saw their sons, relatives, friends crossing the border to join the resistance groups fighting for Kashmir's freedom. Most of these young boys, often working as foot soldiers, were killed in military combats, police custody, or arbitrary shootouts. The children of Kashmir, who saw their fathers, brothers, and friends getting ruthlessly killed by the uniformed men, grew distant from their present while envisioning a partially peaceful future without much understanding of a past that symbolized the true spirit of their homeland. Yet their sense of martyrdom, the religious contentions related to sacrificing one's life for good purpose, the consciousness of good and bad, hell and heaven, were explicit in their actions and reactions. In a scene, Munnu and his friends are seen consoling their classmate Mubasir, whose father has been killed by the military forces. Later, Riaz, one of Munnu's classmates, makes a petrol bomb to throw it on the so-called cowardly Indian bastards, as they usually called them at that point of time in history, as a revenge for killing Mubasir's father. This shows how these children are forced to learn violent measures to attack others or defend themselves from the unending violence around them. Terms like matayos or techniques of making homemade weapons, are similar to learning the alphabets or playing with toys with the children of war. Correspondingly, in a section in his memoir, Pierre speaks about his young cousin who has learned to imitate the political game of mass combats. Here he says, children born just before or after the armed rebellion had become far too intimate with war and fear. My cousin, who was born in the early 90s on a day a gun battle was raging outside the hospital, played a game called Army Militant. I watched him join his friends, carrying wooden guns and broken plastic balls stuffed with cloth meant to be hand grenades. They enacted the bloody drama that unfolded around them. Well, books retailing the stories of Kashmir insurgency have used the motif of graveyards to incur the everlasting grief of the valley as it lost innumerable innocent souls in a war that has changed its landscape forever. Graveyards portray the lost, the heavy grief associated with that lost, and the memory of the people who got lost in the ill-fated chaos. Those who went missing or died in the recurrent battles were claimed to be martyrs and were buried in special graveyards, providing them with a higher status. In another alluring section in his memoir, Pierre revisited one of the historic graveyards in Kashmir. Okay, I see. I'm running out of time, maybe. Or no, it's a 9-minute timer. Okay. So I'll just quote from Pierre's book. For centuries, Kashmiris had buried the dead in neighborhood graveyards. Family members gave the dead person a bath, clothed him or her in a white cotton shroud, and took the body to the neighborhood graveyard for funeral prayers. But the men who were killed by the Indian forces after the rebellion were no ordinary dead. Martyrs do not need baths and shrouds. I had heard this saying often since the winter of 1990. They were mostly buried at the newly built graveyard on the western edge of Srinagar, known as Martyrs' Graveyard. Now, interestingly, in Munnu, Sajjad uses the motif of graves to represent the struggle and anxiety of imprisonment encountered by the children living in war zones. The war imprisons children by snatching away any kind of emotional comfort from them. Sajjad exposes the materiality of a grave to elucidate the inherent fear of death in human beings, the fear of being engulfed by unknown darkness. This carnal fears embedded in our consciousness is embodied through vivid nightmares in his novel. As you can see, virtual depictions of nightmares consume an important segment in the book, which is tactically allied with the little boy's perception of graves and graveyards. Here, Munnu is personifying a dead body, a fleshed physique reduced to a state of an inert object in his nightmares. His reaction to the death of his neighbor turned martyr is traumatic, as he is too young to accept the brutal certainties of his time. Munnu's intensifying trauma, his fear of death, darkness, and oblivion are perceptively depicted by Sajjad over solid black backgrounds, abstract patterns, and dismaying imageries. First few chapters of Sajjad's Munnu visualizes an atmosphere of hopelessness, agony, and melancholy. Gradually, the narrative provides its protagonist with opportunities to heal, to mask his wounds with creativity. Munnu starts drawing political cartoons for the local dailies. His art takes him to different people from diverse backgrounds, which eventually helps him to learn and interpret the history of his homeland. A profound understanding of both the ancient and present times helps Munnu to envisage, embody, and appreciate Kashmir's true spirit, which simultaneously relieves him from his childhood trauma and anxiety. Death remains a constant element in the various stories emerging from the Valley of Kashmir. So are graves and their undeniable presence as leaves, as fallen leaves in autumn. Kashmiri children grow up walking over these leaves, listening to these stories, either praying for a just future or wishing to take revenge on the wrongs done to their communities. In between their prayers and desires, they create history, their own version of a history that has been manipulated over centuries for political control by lusty rulers. These personal narratives, featuring guns, bullets, bombs, wires, protest, ruined buildings, interrogation centers, extended curfews, are consciously obliterated from mainstream historiography. However, these unread narratives have now become their weapon to take back what was once forcefully taken away from them, that is, their freedom. Thank you so much for your patience and listening to me, and for this opportunity, really. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Gabrielina. I think that was a wonderful presentation. And before we have questions, let's move on to the final presentation of the day. We have Samar Singhal with us. Hi, Samar. It's so nice to see you here. And now the stage is all yours.
Hi, Samrat. Long time no see. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Always a pleasure to present for Aklisa. This is my second time presenting for you guys, and I'm very, very excited. So without further ado, I don't really have a PPT, even though technically I'm working with visual art. I should present visual art, but I thought no. For this presentation, what I want to do is present to this gathering the stakes of thinking about the Adivasi picture book and how that helps us think about other related issues. First things first, how would we place this in this niche subdiscipline called picture book studies? The text that really revolutionized picture book studies, within children's fiction studies and this burgeoning field of picture book studies is really Evelyn Arispe and Modak Stiles' Children Reading Picture Book. Over the last decade of the 20th century, Arispe and Stiles went to about 5 or 6 schools in London across different districts and tried to think about how is it that children respond to picture books, assuming that children are the intended audience for these picture books. And what they found was that children bring immense, rich insights, both in terms of visual analysis, but also in terms of intellectual, ideological commitment to what they are reading. And one way to think about that is not just through their words, but also the images or the sketches and drawings that children themselves create. Now, I begin my presentation with Arispe and Stiles' 2003 Children Reading Picture Books, only to establish why and how my work is different. Arispe and Stiles are thinking about reception. I, on the other hand, and this would have been evident in the paper that I sent ahead of time, I'm thinking about the production of picture books. I'm thinking about the kind of work, both visual, craft, labor, that goes into producing these picture books, who makes them, who crafts them. And my work is not really thinking about reception. I'm thinking about the crucial identity of the producer or the illustrator, which in this case is an Adivasi body creating art. Before I move on to discussing other aspects of these kinds of picture books produced by Tara, enabled by Tara, I do want to place how we may think of particular key words in any discourse about Adivasi studies. The word tribal, of course, in post-independent India is state speak, right? In terms of affirmative action, the Indian Constitution grants a particular category under the scheduled tribes. So certain tribes are scheduled in the constitution and they can then ask for and be granted affirmative action in terms of reservation. But if we're thinking about the kinds of words that are used in the multiple conversations that take place around Adivasi bodies, tribal is merely one word. And as I said, it's part of how the state would think of it. Other words that have become very important across the 20th century are Adivasi as well as indigenous. Adivasi is a term that came into political usage in the early 20th century, precisely out of Central and East India, especially in terms of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and the idea that Adivasis would like a state of their own. The term indigenous is slightly more recent and slightly more global, international. It comes into global usage in the last 2 decades of the 20th century with the United Nations and the International Labour Organization trying to think about common ways of defining and common ways of asking for political action from globally brutalized indigenous communities. Indigeneity in India has always been contested. Sociologists, for example, spent at least 2 decades trying to define indigeneity in India. The scholarly consensus is that while it may be very difficult to define clearly indigeneity in India, precisely because of so many internal migrations, and there's no way, unlike, say, with Australia, unlike North America, unlike Canada, or even New Zealand, to think of a very concrete historical disjuncture, in this case, European colonization, that cannot work with India, but precisely because there have been multiple movements, right? Do you think that the Aryan influx should be one way to think about the historical disjuncture? Are we thinking about indigeneity in terms of regions? Are we thinking about indigeneity of nations? Oh, thank you, Arpita. Sorry, I need to speak louder. Is there anything you'd like me to repeat? All right. I was talking about indigeneity in India and how it's almost impossible to define it. So what we have now is that almost a translation, a constructed translation of the word indigeneity has become Adivasi. Adivasi, technically, as some of us may know, translates to eternal inhabitant. And again, depending on who's speaking, you may use the term indigenous, you may use the term Adivasi. Indigenous is more global facing. The reason that I give you this context is to begin talking about this very pernicious binary between art and craft. No surprises who created this binary. It was the British, and it is really the 19th century when both in Britain and in British colonies, this category of art versus craft is concretized. Art becomes something that's created by quote unquote artists who are trained in particular academies. Craft becomes communal. Saloni Mathur would call it a community of craft, as if to say that these craft communities, what is now sometimes called handicrafts, always existed in some amorphous collective mass until the British arrived to differentiate and individualize them. Jyotirendra Jain, who's taught at JNU, who's been the director of the Crafts Museum in Delhi, who's also been the director of the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, IGNCA, for example, identifies this as a problem when folks start talking about Adivasi artistic cultural production. The idea is that they will only be thought of as an amorphous collective, and the idea, the intent is to individualize them, to say that the moment you think of Adivasi as a collective, you're freezing them in a certain time lag. You're unable to think about dynamism. You're unable to think about individual artists creating a certain dent in art writing, in art networks. And so the analysis that I do in the paper that I submitted takes from Professor Jain's idea that it's important to individualize not just Jangar Singh Sham, the progenitor of Pardhan Gond painting in Bhopal, but also his family, his progeny, as it were, who are taking from him, who are inspired by him, but they're charting their own path in the way they think about cultural productions, whether that's acrylics on canvas, whether that's oils on canvas, whether that's illustrated books with more than one publisher, or particularly with Tara Books, gorgeously crafted picture books. So this project and this paper then is intervening not just in 20th century modern Indian art history, but also anthropology. And it's taking from children's fiction studies, picture book studies, and postcolonialism, precisely because some of the most important historiographical work that we have in terms of tracing a particular resistant history of Adivasis across West, Central, and East India comes to us from Ranajit Guha and his colleagues. Now, with that, I can talk about this particular community, this particular artistic community. Jangar Singh Sham came to Bhopal in the early 1980s. And this is where the story is that he crafted this particular art form almost out of nothing. He's the first artist, first individual from that community to actually give iconic form to his own Gond and iconic deities. What I do want to mention is that Gond painting, which it has now come to be known as, is a misnomer. The Gonds are the second largest Adivasi community in India, but they are heavily differentiated internally speaking. This particular community that actually handcrafts this particular kind of art are the Pardhan Gonds. The Pardhans were the oral storytellers of the Gond courts and Gond households in central India. Every year or every couple of years between February and April, a particular Pardhan Gond man would travel to villages, would have a particular route charted out for him, and would perform this kind of storytelling between 2 to 5 days in each household. And at the end of every performance, the lady of the household would give him a quote unquote daan. Right. So there's a particular cultural function accorded to the Pardhan Gond performer / oral storyteller. The Shamrao Hewale, for example, says that they were the genealogists of the Gond tribes, right? So the stories they would tell were not only of fathers and fathers of fathers, kings of kings, so on and so forth, but also talk about particular stories that are important to the Gond community. For example, one story which is similar to the Ramayana in that it takes from the Ramayana, has this character called Lakshman, right? Lakshman happens to be the younger brother of Ram, the aggressive younger brother of Ram. But for the Gonds, Ramayana is not about Ram, it's about Lakshman. It's about Lakshman's travails, Lakshman's adventures, especially with demons and mostly female demons who want to entice him, but he's brahmachari, so he will not be enticed. And that's where all the drama from these stories comes in. I bring that story up to say that in the repertoire of the Pardhan Gonds, there exists the Gondwani, which is stories around Gond legends and kings, and the Pandwani comes from the word Pandav, of course. These are stories of local heroes, local legends. Now, this is the context in which Bhajusha illustrates creation in 2014 for Tara Books. And when I say, for example, in my paper that Bhaju Sham is able to innovate, he's able to bring his cultural function that's according to him as a Pardhan Gond into the picture book by narrating a story which precisely what the Pardhan Gonds did in the 20th century before that tradition slowly is eking out of their lives. But he also innovates. The Pardhan Gond storytellers will narrate stories that are Gondwani or that are Pandwani, but are not really thinking about or performing stories about stories. Samrat, I see you've raised a hand. I will slowly bring this to a close. What Bhaju Sham is able to do is tell a story about the origin of his art in that particular illustration, which is the birth of art. And the birth of art actually comes to Bhaju Sham from his uncle, who happens to be Jangar Singh Sham. And that is the point that I'm making, that when you deconstruct the binary between art and craft, when you're thinking about who produces the picture book, when you're thinking about individualizing a particular picture book in the body, in the oeuvre of one particular artist who happens to be Adivasi, it's very important, as Jyotendra Jain says, to look for individuality. And which is why the argument in this paper and across the dissertation that I'm writing is that the Adivasi picture book, when crafted, when illustrated by an Adivasi artist, as in this case the Pardhan Gond artists, and collaborated with, enabled by an alternative publisher like Tara Books, gives you a sense of auto-ethnographic self-representation. These are artists who are illustrating themselves in the way Bhajusham would do by talking about the story of this particular art form. And these are artists who are claiming the right to represent on their own terms, which is, for example, why I would say self-representation and auto-ethnography as compared to, say, Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Books, which are set in the central Indian forests where the Gonds live, where the Pradhan Gonds have lived, and Kipling would exercise a particular pejorative, derogatory, almost racist prerogative in describing the bodies of those particular individuals. With that, I will end my presentation. There's a lot more to say, but I hope we can take that up in the Q&A. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Samarth. I think, Samarth, I want to start with you, like the question answers. Till then, I request everyone who have their questions to please submit it in the chat box, and I can take those questions later on. Samarth, let's start with you. And I found in your paper there were these 2-3 terms which are very interesting. We talked about self-presentation, and then there is a move to self-reflexivity, and finally to self-articulation, right? So if you would just want to expand a bit more on this journey, I know you covered that a bit in your paper, but I felt that you didn't get enough time to expand it. So if you could quickly talk about this, from self-representation to self-reflexivity to self-articulation.
Okay, thanks, Amrat. The reason that I'm using all of these words, which perhaps intersect in meaning, is precisely because it is a particular identity of self that is denied when one assumes that the Adivasi is part of an amorphous collective. That right? The perhaps individual thought is denied to them every time any artwork, whether in terms of wood, whether in terms of paper, whether in terms of kali mitti, for example, black sand, is created. The idea is that it's a reflection of a certain craft community. So my usage of these terms is trying to resist this forced, coerced collectivization, right? And that's what Swaminathan, the guy who created Bharat Bhavan, the guy who quote unquote, and this is a controversy, discovered Jangar Singh Sham and Jyotinder Jain have really been hitting at in their oeuvres and careers, which is to say that these are individual artists who can innovate, which is why I use all of these 3 terms, self-representation, self-articulation. What's the third one, Samrat? I forgot. You are muted, Samrat.
Self-representation, self-articulation, and you use self-reflexivity.
Ah, all right, right. Self-reflexivity only because it is, as Bhajusham innovates in the birth of art in creation, it's a self-awareness in terms of a story about a story, right? So that gives you a sense of how this particular storyteller is intensely aware of the origin of this kind of artwork and perhaps how it can be perceived. And self-representation again, and this is why I ended with Kipling, right? Because in Kipling's The Jungle Books, for example, the Gond hunter or the Gond priest is completely denied any voice. I wouldn't say denied any agency, but the representation of the Gond hunter or the Gond priest is meant to expand and enhance the mysteries of the central Indian forest. They are quote unquote incorrigible, incomprehensible. And of course, that is to be expected from Kipling for all his love and affection and derision for India. But in Bhajusham's work, or in Durgabai Vyam's work, or in Venkatraman or Ram Singh Urveti's work, what you get is a completely different affect in terms of how these individuals would individually innovate upon techniques that they have received, whether in Bhopal or in their own community. So that's what I mean when I say self-representation. Does that answer your question, Samrat?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to have a question for Sheenam Batra. And Sheenam, you had a very interesting paper on how play transforms with able and disabled bodies. My question is, if the play is a medium for able bodies to understand disability, doesn't that in fact push certain bodies or disabled bodies to marginalization in the first place? Because if you're basically saying that we need some sort of technique for the able bodies to understand disabled bodies, wouldn't that push disabled bodies to like a space of marginalization?
The argument wasn't basically that. Firstly, the argument I was trying to draft was, the erstwhile history which has always been of a kind of normative, confrontational, and tragic contact that has been there. Second, I was trying to, yes, it might seem, you're very right, because there are problems in the text also with and borrowing from the mythological plot, conventional plot, relying on that sort of history. But like I said, the child, yes, it's also to understand the process of how a child comprehends, what is a disabled body. But it's also equally a relief for the disabled body, like the kind of confession, like I said, that the monstrous disabled body goes into, that, this is the problem with my body, or, that is there, the scatological problem, too much of intimate problem, talking with the able-bodied child, that kind of confession that is there. And since the child, we have to also keep in mind that child doesn't utilize that fact to grapple or to comprehend or to understand, just as a fact of without going into any theory, accepts it, and doesn't try to negotiate or problematize that. One is that. The other thing that I'd like to say, when I was doing my a course on disability studies, there are various models, of disability, of studying disability, a medical model, charity-based model, and social model. So my mentor, one of the things that he taught us was that all these models might be valid and you can contest them based on what you understand. But the one thing that you need to understand is that if a body is disabled, the acceptance has to come from inside. Like I was talking about my own lived experience, that yes, if it can create that kind of horror in child, So I don't, simply think that it marginalizes them, because it equally gives, the disabled body the kind of private confession and the bonding that it develops, the mode of cordiality. Definitely there are contestations, but I would still keep, that space open for a certain kind of generous reading where the body is not simply marginalized. That would be my argument.
All right, thank you. Debolina, for your paper, I have a question. And after that, we'll move on to certain common questions for you all. So I have a question for you, is that there is a lot of mirroring which takes place in your paper, which is like could you talk about the use of that technique to talk about a certain kind of politics, status quo, or violence for that matter?
Well, by mirroring, you mean the parallels that I drew between two authors, or about the sketches that I kind of...
The sketches, like the deers and then the children and the workers going into the factory, that.
Okay. So what was your question? I just
my question was use of mirroring as a technique to understand and address politics or status quo, or even for that matter, violence.
Okay, so